Good afternoon. I can say afternoon barely because it's 3 minutes after noon. I was this morning looking for more people to send the link to my article to about Charles Dickens and A Christmas Carol. And occasionally I'll come across yet another professor, or I might come across a reporter or blogger or something, and sometimes you can get their information. And I tried various creative things, and I came across an article. Now, this article, it's a popular article, and it does not have citations. So at this point, I can't say that this information is accurate. I'm going to follow up on it. It's an A.N. Wilson is the man who's the reporter, and I have his contact information. There's a contact form online for him. In a couple of weeks, when I send the link to my article to everybody else, I'm going to send him one and ask him for the references. And we'll see. Obviously it's too late to add this into the article itself. So we'll see. But there's some serious dirt on Dickens in this article, things that I wasn't aware of. Now, the information from Professor John Bowen, which I've talked about recently, having to do with Dickens trying to have his wife, Catherine, committed to an insane asylum so he could carry on his affair, that much is documented. And I'm trying to get the photographs of the original documentation myself from Houghton Library at Harvard. It's on order. So that I can confidently talk about, and I put that in my article. This stuff, he just speaks as though it's fact, without telling us where he got it from. I don't know if he means to say that it's generally known. He speaks as though it's generally known, but this is new stuff for me, some of it. So I'm going to go through it. I can't read this whole article. It's rather long. But I want to go through this on camera. The thing is that if he is or was as characterized in this article, he could not have written A Christmas Carol. And the reason is that A Christmas Carol, again, is inspired literature. This will make no sense to a person who does not have experience of inspiration, a person that doesn't have experience of having been inspired by higher realms. They won't understand this. They will believe that any person, any scoundrel, could write nice literature, because that's what they think A Christmas Carol is nice literature. It is not nice literature. It's inspired literature. And a person of low moral character whose heart is clogged up with worldly things cannot do that. So Jesus said, the pure in heart can see God, something to that effect. And that principle also applies to lesser things than seeing God. It means that the pure in heart can have experiences of being inspired, by the higher realms. Same principle, lower degree. So a person who is not of pure heart cannot have these experiences and cannot understand why Charles Dickens could not have written A Christmas Carol. Now, if you've looked at the comments on my website, the negative comments, these are aggressive, mean, prejudiced, deliberately irrational comments. These people are not of pure heart, no matter what they think intellectually, no matter how advanced they think they are intellectually, their hearts are not right. And that's why people who speak out against what I'm trying to do sound mean and ignorant. It's not an accident. Okay? So that said, now I've got to start this up again. 4-3, excuse me. Okay, so we have the article entitled Dickens Was Cruel to His Wife and Hated His Mother, writes A.N. Wilson. So I think this is an article by A.N. Wilson, but for some reason the title refers to him in third person. I don't know why. So it talks about his affair. They call her Nellie Ternan here. I had always seen her referred to as Ellen Ternan, which I think was her given name. And they have a picture of Dickens here with his daughters. I'm going to put this URL underneath this entry so you can see this for yourself. I have a picture of Dickens with his daughters in 1865 out in the garden. They talk about the way Dickens died, which was news to me. Apparently, the inference in this article is that he was having sex with Nellie, and he had some kind of a heart attack or stroke or something, and she arranged for him to be taken back to his house because she thought it would look really bad for him if he died there at her place, you know. I don't know if that's historical fact or if it's extrapolation or how much of that is real. And they have a picture of Nellie here. And he says, the fact that Dickens, a leading champion of Victorian family values, did not wish the world to know he had a mistress necessitated a life of constant subterfuge and deception, which had been the pattern of his existence for the previous 13 years since he first met Nellie when she was just 18 and acting on the West End stage. We know somebody else that was a public champion of family values. Actually, we know a number of people like that turned out to be hypocritical and be having affairs and so on. This is not anything new. Then he says, Dickens, the father of 10 children, 9 of them living, was a man with a keen sexual appetite who brought to his love life the same hyper-exuberant energy that he expended on all his other favorite activities: acting, traveling, journalism, writing, charity work, entertaining his literary friends, and fatherhood. So that's his take on it. See, the writer of this article has a certain take. Everybody has a spin, a take on, you know, their basic assumptions when they go to write an article. And his assumption is that, you know, he just had a big sexual appetite and he had some certain human flaws, you know, but he was still, you know, a literary genius and so on. My take is quite different. My take is that he was a plagiarist and that where he looks like a genius, most of it is him stealing other people's ideas. Technically, he could write, no question about it. But that it was, if he left to his own devices, you know, he would be writing very sensational stuff, you know, not elevating stuff. And my take on it is that the charity work was just a cover, like a corporation that has a, you know, a philanthropic branch, you know, and they advertise about the wonderful things that they're doing to make them look better. It's all PR. Well, that's what Dickens, as a one-man literary corporation, was doing with his charity work, in my personal opinion. Let's see. So it talks about how Nellie arranged for Dickens' semi-conscious body to be brought back to the house. Let's see. Then he says the official version of events would always be that England's greatest novelist had died peacefully at home, surrounded by his children, busy working on his next book until the very end. Indeed, there are some scholars who still believe that this is what happened and that the visit to Peckham never took place, and yet the mystery remains. I'm sorry, I'm trying to read too fast. So there's apparently some controversy as to whether to believe this version or not. I'd like to know where he gets it. This is a result of my not being a deep Dickens scholar. You know, I've delved into Dickens' life where and how I had to in order to deal with this question, but I have not spent the 5 years it would take to really study Dickens' life completely. Let's see. As the 150th anniversary of his death approaches next month, the precise details of the last few hours of Dickens' life remain uncertain. So again, I don't know where he's getting these reports. And then he talks about the contradictions and complications in his attitude to women. So now he talks about his cruelty to his long-suffering wife, Catherine. Verbal abuse and obsession with tidiness and even with what women wore were all aspects of his complex personality. His need for control eventually took its ultimate expression in one of his most bizarre interests, hypnotism. I'm not too much concerned about that. Apparently he hypnotized Catherine and some other people. He talks about his traumatic childhood of his father being in debtor's prison and him having to go to some kind of a workhouse, sent to work at Warren's blacking factory to polish, and somehow or other that scarred him for life, that experience. And he blamed his mother and later poured out all his anger and loathing into the hideous, neglectful mother figures that inhabit his novels. I don't know, it seems like speculation. I don't know if he really hated his mother or not. Clearly, this is a sensationalist article, but my question is how much of it has, real basis to it. This is more about how Dickens felt abandoned by his mother, hadn't seen her for many months by the time he died. He is being a control freak. Neatness as an obsession. Well, nobody's perfect. You could find things on Matthew Franklin Whittier that are not laudable too, that I'm not particularly proud of for him. But he was a man of integrity, whereas I don't think that Dickens was. Then he says, by the time Catherine was in her 40s, petulant, red-faced, and with bad teeth, cracks in the marriage were starting to show. Dickens began to punish her as he had felt the need to punish his mother. I don't know what he bases that on. So strained were the couple's relations that Dickens' ex-publisher, Frederick Evans, and colleague William Wills refused to go to his home. This, said Evans, was because, quote, they could not stand his cruelty to his wife. When asked by a friend what he meant, Evans explained swearing at her in the presence of guests, children, and servants, swearing often and fiercely. He was downright ferocious. I think she just got old, and didn't look so good, and he wanted to replace her with a fresh model. You should read the violated letter, the letter that he wrote, which went public. I think he intended for it to go public, sanctimoniously denying that he was having an affair. And just to see the sheer hypocrisy of the man, I strongly recommend that to everybody. You can find it online very easily. Just put in Dickens violated letter and you'll get it. Then they talk about how Dickens basically split the house in half without even telling Catherine to keep them separate. But he'd been apparently having an affair for years, according to this. And this may even be the violated letter he's quoting. I'll have to check. He says he concluded his letter accusing Catherine of the most miserable weaknesses and jealousies. Her mind has at times been certainly confused besides. So you get the idea. This man is carrying on an affair, and he attacks his wife for daring to be jealous and daring to be confused. And the violated letter suggests that he was able to put on this facade of tremendous apparent integrity. See, so he would, so he put on this great show of being this great, wonderful person, and the whole time for 13 years he was carrying on the affair, and intuitively she knew it, see, and when she would dare to protest, he would attack her for it. Well, I've been in that situation myself on the receiving end, so I know exactly what it feels like. He says such language of the sort which would make Catherine doubt her own sanity suggests we are in the territory of the 1940s psychological thriller Gaslight, which I'm not familiar with. Probably a similar case where somebody's, acting dishonorably and trying to make the person that questions think they're crazy. It's an old game, It was at this point, according to their daughter Katie, that Dickens turned into, quote, a madman. So I'm going to pass by a whole bunch of stuff. Talks about his the girl he had his affair with, Nellie Ternan. Then it says, ever a campaigner for social justice and a champion of the underdog, he had proposed and helped set up in 1847 a refuge for, quote, fallen women, many of them prostitutes. His idea was that after the women had been rescued, they would be enabled to travel to Australia to begin a new life. Bought the linen, the carpets, and the curtains. It was even he who chose the women's clothes. I have made them as cheerful in appearance as they reasonably could be, at the same time very neat and modest. We don't know if he had sex with any of them. But I think this is all crap. It's all for show. It's all PR. And when somebody like this is doing things that look noble, there's generally two layers of, motivation involved. I had never read that he was into that particular project, but I'm guessing that he found a little fun in it, regardless. But I don't know. It's just speculation. And it talks about him hypnotizing Catherine. I'm getting to the part that really struck me. I'm not there yet. Then there was a woman who, when he was hypnotizing people, there was some woman that came to be hypnotized by him regularly, and he spent a lot of time with her alone, and Catherine was getting jealous. Madame de la Rue, he met in Italy, who was looking for a cure for tics and hallucinations, says, although it is not entirely clear whether he slept with her, Dickens's intimacy with her caused Catherine enormous distress, and Dickens called it unreasonable behavior. Contemporary accounts suggesting that Dickens found it most exciting to perform his mesmeric tricks on women. Bill Cosby comes to mind with this, not for the first time here while I've been reading. Then he in 1858, he started touring Britain with one-man performances. Now, this is the part that struck me, that was news to me. And I'm going to read from here on out, at least for a while anyway. For in 1858, Dickens had begun touring Britain with one-man performances of his most famous novels. It was these shows that brought him global stardom and increased his already considerable wealth. His favorite portrayal was that of the brutal death of the prostitute Nancy at the hands of her lover, Bill Sikes, from his novel Oliver Twist. In 1863, he confessed that, privately, he had performed an imaginary reenactment of Nancy's killing, quote, but I have got something so horrible out of it that I am afraid to try it in public. Now, in my paper, I document that his illustrator, I forget the name now, said that he was the one that offered the ideas for Oliver Twist, that the ideas for Oliver Twist were not Dickens. And the impression one gets is that it was originally intended to be a morality tale, but that Dickens took it and sensationalized it, just like he did with A Christmas Carol. He turned The Christmas Carol into a, quote, ghost story, see? Well, he did the same thing apparently with Oliver Twist. This is how he got famous. This is how you get the votes of a vast number of worldly people, is to titillate them with sensational stuff like this. Okay? Had he written Oliver Twist, or had he just passed along A Christmas Carol without modifying it the way they were originally from the inspired authors, he would never have gotten famous because he wouldn't have had that many worldly people liking it. So here he says his manager, George Dolby, was fiercely against the plan to include the murder scene in public, as it was inappropriate for a show meant to appeal to all ages, and because of its likely effect on Dickens' health. Apparently got him very excited. Dickens' family were equally opposed. His son Charlie later told how he was working in the library at the family home when he heard the sound of violence taking place outside in the garden. It sounded as if a tramp was beating his wife. As the noise continued, alternately brutal shouts and female screaming, Charlie decided to intervene, only to find his father outside on the lawn murdering an imaginary Nancy with ferocious gestures. When Dickens asked his son what he thought, Charlie replied, "It is the best thing I've seen, but don't do it." But Dickens had made up his mind. He went ahead and performed 28 renditions of Nancy's murder. It became an obsession with him. He told his friend William Wills that his performance had a transformative physical effect upon him. Quote, "My ordinary pulse is 72 and it runs up under this effort to 112, he wrote, besides which it takes me 10 or 12 minutes to get my mind back at all, I being in the meantime like the man who lost the fight." I don't know what that reference is. I guess it's just to fighting. After the scene was finished, there would be total silence in the hall. Dickens then went backstage, often walking with difficulty, and would be forced to lie on a sofa for some minutes before he once more became capable of speech. He would recover and, quote, after a glass of champagne, would go on the platform again for the final reading. In other words, he got off on it. It is almost as if Dickens had released a genie from the bottle of whose sexually violent existence he had been scarcely aware. Indeed, he liked to joke about his, quote, murderous instincts, and his reenactment of the killing, quote, "I have a vague sensation," he said, "of being, quote, wanted as I walk about the streets." The inevitable happened at Chester in April 1869 when Dickens had a minor stroke on stage. A doctor was summoned and ordered that the tour be canceled forthwith. But Dickens' obsession with the scene refused to leave him. Months after the shows had ended, and shortly before his death a year later, he was discovered performing the slaying of Nancy once again in the privacy of his own garden. In other words, he's not practicing, you know. And he concludes this article saying, in the week before his fateful final trip to his mistress Nellie in Peckham, Dickens and his daughter Katie sat up until 3 a.m. talking. Relaxed after a pleasant dinner followed by brandy and cigars, he confided in her about his relationships and his regrets. He wished he had been a better father, a better man, she later recalled. That's under the influence of the brandy. They don't say how much brandy, but I don't think he had a little snifter or whatever. In other words, he was drunk and he, admitted all these things. Many of those who knew him might well have agreed. A flawed genius, perhaps, but one whose writings a century and a half after his passing continue to enthrall and delight. But they're not his writings. This is the fatal flaw in this argument. It's not his work. The work that looks inspired, elevating, spiritual was not his. It was somebody else's idea, and then he took it and dumbed it down spiritually and ethically, made of it sensationalist literature. The stuff like the murder of Nancy by Bill Sykes, that's him. See, that's what he really likes, It goes to how I define genius, as I've talked about before. Genius in a materialistic society is thought of as like having a powerful computer. You can think fast, you can remember stuff right away. You have, a photographic memory, and you can process stuff really fast and make connections really fast and out-argue other people because of this power of your brain. See, that's a genius in a materialistic society. In a spiritual society, that is not genius, because the intelligence of the higher realm, I didn't really articulate this before, the intelligence of the higher realm is beyond any genius we have here, far beyond. First off, it's intuitive, it's integrated, it's sight. The intelligence of the higher world is sight, It's not conceptual manipulation. So when a person in the physical world gets a blast from the higher world, he then has to try to translate it. The artist has to try to translate it in brushstrokes. The writer has to try to translate it in words and paragraphs and still retain the power of the initial vision, see? The photographer has to somehow or other capture the image in such a way that the higher inspiration comes through and is triggered in the viewer. That's genius, real genius. If you define genius that way, a person of low character with a sullied heart cannot express genius. It's impossible, Therefore, Dickens could not possibly have written A Christmas Carol. And this is self-evident to anyone who has cleaned their heart, has tuned into spiritual realities above our reality, and knows it when he or she sees it. Whatever I may or may not have by way of talents, I have been following a spiritual path for 47 years. And even before then, as Matthew Franklin Whittier, I can demonstrate time and time again that Matthew was also tuned into this higher realm, as was Abby, his wife and partner. So, and probably previous lives before that, because it takes, a number of lifetimes to get to where you can do that. Like all abilities, it doesn't just happen in one life. I think it takes maybe 10 lifetimes of pursuing any particular line of talent to really get to where you're at the level where you're really able to do it. So as someone who can perceive these things, I'm telling you that A Christmas Carol is an inspired work, and I'm telling you that Charles Dickens, if he's anything like we've just read, could not possibly have done so. So then the question is, who wrote it? And that's where the detective work comes in. And that's where the last 3/4 of my article comes into play. And I would hope that some people actually read the whole article, and don't get bogged down in the question of Dickens. What's interesting about this article that I just read is I don't know how long, I forget when this article was written. Let's see if I can tell when this came out, because it's news to me, but I can't imagine that this is news to the scholars, the Dickens scholars. They have to have known this, for some time now. They have to have known this and been making mistakes. Now, I don't see when this was published. It says 2020, so this is relatively new. This has actually come out, I think, after John Bowen's work came out, about the fact that Dickens definitely tried to have Catherine put in an insane asylum. So this is fairly new. I would say that this is an offshoot of what I was talking about earlier, the shit that's hit the fan since John Bowen spilled the beans on Dickens. So now all of a sudden people are starting to look at him in a different light, see, and not a very favorable light. But they still believe that he was a genius, quote unquote. They still believe that he was a social reformer. I don't. Any more than I believe that some big corporations are sincere when they have their philanthropic branch, and advertise it on TV about the wonderful things that they're doing. It's all for the bottom line, Well, somebody like Dickens, he would have twisted it to the bottom line as well. Now, about him helping out these prostitutes, I have no idea, Edgar Allan Poe is just as bad. Margaret Fuller was an egotist. I don't think that her personal life was as far, off as Dickens' personal life was. She eventually married, but she was hugely egotistical. She couldn't possibly have written those articles that Matthew wrote that were attributed to her, because Matthew was a genuine mystic and a genuine social reformer with deep feeling for the underdog and for people who are in distress. And Margaret Fuller played at being a transcendentalist. Matthew was a genuine mystic. There's no comparison. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, as I read her personal life, I'm not sure where she got the idea, but she desperately wanted to be a great literati, so she stole people's work, and then she thought that she could write just as well herself. And she wrote poetry on her own, but the poetry she wrote on her own is it's overblown, it's tedious, it goes on and on and on and on and on. It's technically, it's highly intellectual, but it's no expression of any higher, experience. It's just overblown imitation, basically. And, all four of these people were phonies, really. And as I've explained, there's a reason why they became famous. You have to appeal to the lower denomination, the lowest denomination in order to get famous. The people that don't do that are basically unknown, like Matthew Franklin Whittier and Abby Poyen Whittier. So here I am in a position trying to prove my reincarnation case. And the more I delve into it, the more I find that they were the real authors of these works. So, can I get these works away from these famous people that falsely claim them? Again, as a nobody, can I do that? We'll see. I'm looking into the possibility of setting up a funding operation online, not with Patreon, but there's another one. I forget the name of it now. I'm looking into it. I couldn't sign in when I tried this morning. I will do it only if it doesn't require setting up priority levels, bronze, silver, gold, whatever they call it, where certain people that pay more get more privileges. I refuse to do that. It's unethical. If I can get around that and set up one that doesn't have levels like that, I'll probably do it. I don't expect much in the way of donations, but what I would use them for is advertising, because I think that I could get this information, not just my books, but the information in general. I could get it out to a wider audience if I could run some ads. And I can't afford it. I don't have any income at this point. I have savings, but, I'm watching it slowly slip, So if I could get a little account set up and do a little crowdsourcing, I might be able to do some advertising, and maybe we'll get this information out to more people. I'll talk about that or post about that on my own website in the updates. Anything you want to know about what's going on with my project, go to the updates section on my website and I'll have it there. So this is just intriguing. I am not saying this is fact because I can't verify it yet. But most intriguing to me with my counseling background is this business of him reenacting almost as a sordid fantasy, reenacting this murder scene. It's like it really doesn't have anything to do with it being a theatrical representation of one of his stories. It's something he's getting off on in his imagination, you know, beyond the point where he's practicing, beyond the point where his doctor will even let him perform it publicly. He's going back and doing it himself privately. See, this is a very unhealthy individual, you know, and it gives you an idea. You know, it works both ways, but it gives you an idea of where he was coming from when he wrote it. This is not a social reformer using sordid events as the necessary fuel for a morality tale. This is somebody that's doing it gratuitously. See, this is what you get from that little account. Everything sensational and low and sordid in Dickens' work is done gratuitously. It's not done as part of an effort to raise people's morality. Whereas A Christmas Carol was done strictly from the highest motives. See, these things are obvious to me. I can't believe that I even have to express these things as opinions. They're so obvious. But this particular little bit of information is very, very interesting to me with my counseling background. And I will do what I can to verify it, to see where this comes from and how much extrapolation is going on, how much it's rumor, and how much it's actually based on fact. So we shall see.